Fission Radio Show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV Radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Vision radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank our affiliate here in Eugene, Oregon, for carrying our shows. Remember to tell your friends and family you can only listen to us online. We are on, obviously, you're listening to us, www.ucy.tv, or on YouTube on UCY TV. We have a podcast that airs probably about a half an hour after the show's over. So I want to thank you for joining us. Today I'm really excited. We have with us one of the contributing editors to nuclearnews.net who has not interviewed with us before. We've had on Sean and Hervé Courtois, Sean McGee and Hervé Courtois. And today we have on Noelle Wauchope, who is really been an activist all of her life. So thank you, Noelle, for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so I asked you before we started one of the things that you'd like to talk about, and I think this topic you brought up is something that most Americans and most people, at least in the Western Hemisphere, are not aware of, and that is the continuing effort by the Australian government to make them the really nuclear waste dump site of the world. So can you bring us up to speed? Have they started taking a lot of nuclear waste in Australia?
No, we have laws that absolutely, both state and federal laws that prohibit any development of nuclear waste facilities or nuclear reactors, nuclear processing, even uranium enrichment. At present we have those laws, federal and state, that prohibit that. However, we do have one small research reactor, and we have got nuclear wastes from that, and the federal government is now engaged in trying to set up a waste dump, a repository in one state to take that. But that, a lot of us believe that that's a bit of a cover for the plan that's been put forward for years by many lobbyists and some politicians, quite a lot of politicians, to make Australia become the world's hub of nuclear waste dumping.
Why would they want to contaminate the Southern Hemisphere with nuclear waste when most of it is in the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, I don't think they worry about that at all. They actually were so confident that it would happen that they held a royal commission just last year held in South Australia. Now, this is a big inquiry that normally would be done by judges, but this time was done by military people, really. And they put up all sorts of arguments why South Australia should import the world's nuclear waste. And the commission, not surprisingly, came out with the conclusion, yes, we should do this. But what they didn't expect, that it was strongly challenged, particularly by Aboriginals, but also by many people and many economists and other people, and the South Australian government had to back down and decide against it. So that was quite a big setback for the movement, but they've not given up.
Yeah, that seems to be their MO. They don't give up. They just they wait for people to stop paying attention, and then they keep going again. You know what I mean? That seems to be their whole. I personally haven't been an activist for very long in this regard. Actually, I actually believe President Obama when he said everything was fine after Fukushima. I remember thinking, thank goodness President Obama's there, and how great it is that we have someone who they know how to take care of this. I had a nightmare about a year after it happened in May of 2012, and I saw the whole sky orange. I thought Hanford was on fire. And I went to the internet and discovered Fukushima is completely out of control. Completely. And that's when I really started. It is still out of control. So,
well, apparently it is still out of control from everything I can read.
Me too. I did an update on my YouTube channel last night, and they've got a new robot. And the interesting thing is, whenever they put out these robot stories, they don't tell you that their robots have died in place in the middle of. They don't. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I mean,
they leave that bit out.
Yeah, they do. And so, you've been doing this for a long time. Why don't you tell us, how long have you actually been an anti-nuke activist? Or really, I call this a social justice activism because it goes beyond just nuclear.
Well, pretty much all my life, on and off. As a young person, I was active against it, and then we had a strong period in Australia against uranium mining. And things that people have forgotten now, there was a big movement against uranium mining in Australia, and the Labor Party absolutely forbade it, but then later changed their minds when they got into power and allowed it to go ahead. And then Dr. Helen Caldecott started a big campaign against the French nuclear testing in the Pacific. They were testing above ground, atmospheric nuclear bomb testing in the Pacific. And, of course...
Was that in the 80s? Was that in the 80s?
That was in the 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
And, of course, this was terribly bad for the Pacific Islanders, but it also meant that some clouds brought radioactive isotopes across to the east coast of Australia. And it was interesting that one of the most prominent people that was advising the government, Professor Ernest Titterton, he managed to stop the monitoring of radiation, so that they stopped monitoring, so nobody knew if radiation arrived on our east coast.
Wow.
Well, Dr. Caldecott ran this big campaign, and I helped in that in a small way. Got myself nearly into jail, actually. And she was finally successful. The Australian government paid a bit of notice, and the French were more or less intimidated into stopping atmospheric bomb testing. So that was a big push in the very early 80s, around about 1980. But the push has been on and off, but was renewed a few years ago in 2007 when we got John Howard as Prime Minister, and he was very keen for the nuclear industry to go ahead in this country. And the push has been on ever since. And so I've been taking part with Friends of the Earth and any organisations that are opposed to be involved in marches, lobbying, writing to politicians. And I started an Australian website in 2007 to oppose the movement for nuclear power.
Do you guys have any power plants in Australia?
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Do you have any nuclear power plants in Australia?
We have one research reactor in Sydney. It's run by the Australian, Nuclear and Science, Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, ANSTO, and it's government funded and gets a lot of government money, but we don't know how much. And that organisation is very prominent in pushing for nuclear power in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I meant to tell you before, when the movement came to import the wastes, that was publicised a lot, and very strongly followed by American companies, usually those new companies like Terrestrial Energy and General Atomics, trying to think, Transatomic, that's the one, companies that wanted to sell their reactors to Asian countries. And part of the promise in selling nuclear power to Asian countries is that the wastes could come across to South Australia. So housing the nuclear wastes of the world was a kind of selling mechanism to encourage countries to take up nuclear power.
This is really shocking that anybody even considers nuclear power after Fukushima. I mean, Fukushima, don't you think it's outrageous they say that they're decommissioning it? They're not decommissioning it.
I also think it's outrageous that we will now see a great big push for the Tokyo Olympic Games in 2020, and we'll be told that Fukushima are all perfectly safe and clean now, and the games will be sort of used as part of the propaganda.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I contend that we're going to see some young athletes having heart attacks. That they're going to be stopped in their tracks pretty quickly because some of them will be going into these areas that are high levels of radioactivity and not even being told. They'll be training there for weeks.
I have my doubts that would happen.
You do?
And even if it did happen, I think it would be very difficult to prove the connection. And I suspect that the levels of radiation would not be that high. I think, to my mind, the long-term danger is for the population in those areas, the increased risk of cancer and heart problems and other illnesses that might not appear for 20, 30 years, 40 years even afterwards.
Well, the hard part is that, as we know, they're not even testing. People aren't allowed to go to a doctor and say, hey, I think I'm affected by the radiation from Fukushima. I mean, frankly, here in the United States, most doctors, my niece went to the doctor and she flew from Seattle to Los Angeles. Her kids got very sick from the airplane. And she went to her doctor and said, do you think they've been exposed to like radioactive contaminants in the air? And he basically yelled at her and said, you're listening to a conspiracy theory. There's nothing wrong with radioactivity. We're fine.
The trouble is it's a sort of a statistical thing. I mean, you could even say that in the Fukushima area, whereas perhaps in Fukushima, I think the chances, say, there might be, say, normally 30 people in 1,000 would develop cancer. Then years later, perhaps now, 31 people in 1,000 would develop. I mean, the chances are not that huge, but they're there. And if you were a parent there, and your daughter at age 20 gets cancer, you might think, was she the 31st? Was she the extra one?
Right.
It's really hard to prove individual cases.
That's what they're finding. That's what they're finding in St. Louis, where people are literally, the story of what's going on in St. Louis, where they're living next to a burning nuclear dump site, essentially.
Yes, I've been following Just Moms and the work that they're doing.
It's so outrageous. They're being told they have to prove, and they're actually being told they have to prove which radioactive nuclide is causing their cancer.
Oh, this is nonsense. They could study this epidemiologically. This was done years ago in Love Canal. It's nothing to do with radiation. This is chemical pollution. But it was an interesting story because a woman who was an English teacher, not a scientist, noticed that a lot of people in the town were getting nasty cancers. And she did a tracking of the houses where the cancers occurred, and they followed the whole course of where had been an old canal where chemical companies had poured their chemical wastes. And she was able to prove, simply by epidemiology, that this was the cause. Well, I believe this can be done. This could be done at Westlake Landfill, isn't that the area?
Yeah.
St. Louis?
That's right.
If they compare the rates of cancer in the area to other places, they could surely show that there's a link. It mightn't be prove each individual case, but they could prove a increased incidence in the area. I think this is the way they have to go.
Well, I have a question. It's kind of more of a philosophic question because you've been facing this monster since you were a child, essentially. I mean, you told me you saw the pictures of Hiroshima and, the Auschwitz victims and never really let go of any of that.
That's right. I have never, ever forgotten them. I can't.
How is it that we have all these government... I mean, have you been able to grapple? I still am just nonplussed at the complete lack of curiosity, the complete lack of accountability of the science, the secrecy, the everything that goes along with it. I mean, the complete disregard for life on our planet when it comes to nuclear and chemical pollution.
Well, it's a mystery to me, but I think there are some sociopathic qualities in the people that get into power. I think they just like being in power and they don't really mind who gives them money. Remember, the funding's a big thing. I mean, I was somewhat of a fan of Obama, but I don't think he ever would have got in without funding from the nuclear lobby.
That's true. I actually think they pivoted him. They paid him a lot of money. They were his primary funders, which was, I mean, it was kind of stunning when I found out after the fact that he told us everything was fine and then he went and took a 3-week vacation down to South America. Yeah. That wasn't such a good joke on all of us. And yet he flies, he goes to Hawaii, he swims in their ocean, they eat fish. I mean, I have basically pretty much stopped eating fish since Fukushima's happened. I just can't. Every time I go near it, I think I'm just ingesting poison. It's incomprehensible that people act like I'm just being hysterical when we know we're not even testing our food. They don't test the food in Australia either, do they?
Oh, I think for radiation, no, I don't think so. Wow. But for lots of other things they do. But yeah. I'm still inclined to think, for here at least, that risk from fish is minimal or non-existent at the present time. Fish from Fukushima I'd be worried about.
Well, I will not eat tuna because 100% of the tuna tested positive that they tested from the Pacific. I really basically stay away from everything that comes out of the Pacific. Anything that's in the Pacific, because of that radioactive plume. We know that it's there. We know it's ongoing. And I think every time they have a big storm, they just open up those tanks that are sitting at Fukushima and just let them seep out.
Oh, they do. Oh, yes, they just pour it out. But, of course, it does concentrate upwards in the food chain so that smaller fish are eaten by bigger fish and so on. So you're quite right. The top predators in the sea would be the most risky. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, and tuna would be them.
Yeah,
yes.
Tuna would be them, exactly. I mean, that's kind of even the salmon is, a lot of the salmon, and they're putting salmon back in the rivers, but the salmon swims right past Hanford. I mean, again, we have Hanford, so they just all seem to be sociopathic, How did you start the nuclearnews.net? Why did you start that, and how did you start that?
Well, I think it started because I became aware that Australians know nothing of what is going on in the rest of the world. Fukushima is just a little distant something to them because our media barely covers anything. The media here is controlled over 70% by Rupert Murdoch, and I'm sure your media, Murdoch media, is the same. It's all very pro-nuclear. And the only other good outlet is our national broadcaster, the ABC, but they're strongly pressured too by government and told all the time that they're left-wing, which they're not really. So people just don't learn international things. So in 2007, when we got Prime Minister John Howard wanting to push the nuclear industry, that's when I thought, I've got to do something. So I started the website just for Australia, the Australian one, and as I went along, I became aware that Australians don't even know what's going on overseas, so I better start putting that in. And then I realised so much is going on overseas, I better start another website for overseas. And then suddenly Sean McGee appeared from nowhere and started sending me things, and then Hervé started sending things, and a couple of other people, and I thought, well, we better keep going. So that's how it happened.
So there it is. And it's actually quite... I mean, for me, I know I check in with it at least once a week when I'm doing all my week, making sure I keep up with everything. I mean, for me, it's the go-to place because I've read many of your stories on my radio show. So,
that's encouraging. Thanks.
Yeah, well, because you know what? In fact, that's one of the things I do on my YouTube channel. Last night I read Carl Grossman's, an article by Carl Grossman, because people don't read. They will read the headlines and say, oh, yeah, I know about that. But they don't really read it. But if you read it to them, they'll listen to your YouTube videos, or they'll listen to you on the radio. If you read it to them, they will listen.
Well, this is one reason for my websites, because I know people won't read a whole long article, but they will read a short part of the article. So many of the articles that I put on Nuclear News are just short extracts from the major one. And I sort of hope that people will be sufficiently interested to follow the link and go back to the major article. And that would be good. And I'm trying to counter the propaganda that we're getting in this country. We've got a wonderful propagandist called Ben Hurd. Honestly, he's as clever as Joseph Goebbels in the way that he can twist things and make it look as though nuclear is good. And in America, of course, you've got Michael Schellenberger and others, and a lot of what you might call front groups that pretend to be environmental but are actually anything but.
Like that guy James Hansen, he believes that nuclear is really pretty good. He's not at all against it, you know. They really believe that it's not so bad. And in fact, this is why they're uranium mining while nuclear power plants are not being built. There's huge pushes. This is why they just opened up big bear ears in a national monument, and in this tax scam bill that Trump and the Republicans just passed, they opened up ANWR. Can you believe that? They opened up ANWR for drilling and uranium mining. I don't know how much uranium there is up there, but you know, I'm looking at your map of Australia. A quick look at Wikipedia says that Australia hosts 33% of the world's uranium deposits and the third largest producer of uranium. And there's a little map I found called Australian Map of Nuclear and Uranium Mines. Wow, there's tons of them in your country. So that must be a big producer in your country.
Well, it's not really, because people don't seem to realize, but at the moment the uranium industry is in a pretty sort of tepid state for lots of reasons. I think because the nuclear industry is not powering ahead in America, which is actually still the biggest country for nuclear power. From what I read, there are, the business of South Carolina and now the one in Georgia. Mm-hmm. The likelihood that those new plants, after spending, $9 billion or whatever, are going to not go ahead. There's not such a demand for uranium as there used to be. And also there was a lot of uranium during the process when Obama and Russia, they decided together to sort of use the old stockpiles of military uranium. So it's not a big business in Australia. There are a lot of old closed-down mines that are not functioning, and only a few mines actually still going. The biggest one, of course, is BHP's at Olympic Dam, and that's a massive mine. But even that one is not putting out very much uranium. They've got contracts, but when those contracts run out, it'll be interesting to see whether there are any new good contracts, because they don't make a lot of money out of uranium. It's a very small contributor to the economy here.
Well, that's good to know. That's actually good to know. This is my thing. I do not understand why the nuclear industry has not developed a whole industry to remediate the harm they've caused. They could make billions of dollars because they cause a lot of harm while they're producing, when they're mining, when the plant closes down. Like Fukushima, Japan is just building tank after tank after tank. It's just, you can spot it on the map by the white tanks, essentially, right?
Yeah, well, who pays for all this?
Well, most of the taxpayers, isn't it? The taxpayers?
The taxpayers, yes. Well, I think some of those European nuclear companies would be switching people like EDF might well be switching their money-making operations to the clean-up, decommissioning. Instead of building, let's make money out of decommissioning. But ultimately, it's going to be the taxpayer everywhere, I think.
Yeah, and the human life, the cost to human life that it is causing, like we've seen. I mean, I think across the board we have seen massive amounts of deception and lying about the harm that nuclear energy causes, and the whole nuclear thing. I mean, I did a thing on my YouTube channel where I basically took a picture of the nuclear power sites. And then I took a picture of the CDC keeps track of where all the childhood diseases are. Literally, you could overlay them, and you could see it's not a scientific study, but there's a direct correlation. It's kind of like a good first step. You know what I mean, for a scientific study.
It's a terrific first step. That's epidemiology. Look, I mean, this is a bit off the track, but I think back. Not that I was actually there or even realised at the time, but way back. We're talking about like maybe the 1930s, 1940s. In Britain, Sir Richard Dole, he was Dr. Dole then, but they made him Sir Richard later, he painstakingly did epidemiology about cigarette smoking and cancer. But he also did experiments on mice, setting up heaps of mice and getting them to get addicted to cigarette smoking. Between those two things, the epidemiology and the mice experiments, he was able to prove that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Well, we can't set up a whole lot of people and give them radiation and see if they get cancer. We can't really do that, but we could do the epidemiology. But they're pretty careful not to do it.
They are exactly careful not to do it. That's the bizarre thing, is they make an effort. In fact, I saw maybe there was 10 or 12 scientists at a California symposium. They were talking about the seals that were dying last summer. Not this summer, but the summer before last. There was like 10 or 12 of them. And one of the reporters there said, have you tested any of these seals for radioactivity, suspecting from Fukushima?
Yeah.
They said specifically, we are not testing for any radioactivity from anywhere. We have specifically excluded radioactivity from any of our scientific tests.
And why? Why did they?
Because that was not part of their purview of their test. That was part of their grant, was they could not look at radioactivity.
Well, they got a grant from somewhere where you're not allowed to include radiation.
Probably, which is where they're all at. I mean, you've been an activist for a long time. Has this sort of silent secrecy been part of the industry's, it's like the Manhattan Project was a silent secret program from the beginning, and they've never lost the secrecy.
Well, they had reasons for secrecy, I suppose, then, even though I don't agree with the program, but I can see their reasons. But I think we have to look carefully at the World Health Organization, because when you actually dissect everything, the World Health Organization still says that ionizing radiation causes cancer, that it's especially bad for babies, children, and women more so than men. And the World Health Organization is still on track, and their Director General, I think she still is at the moment, Dr. Margaret Chan, has on the record saying there is no safe level of ionizing radiation. So the World Health Organization is on the right track, but they're very constrained because of the clauses in their purview, whatever you call it, that say that they must not do harm to the International Atomic Energy.
Right.
So they're not allowed to restrict the progress of the atomic nuclear power industry. So they're kind of constrained. They can't really tell it like it is very much. And so they get a lot of flack for this reason, and I still support them because I think basically they're trying to do the right thing. But they're very constrained.
Well, I know that for a long time, in fact, they just stopped last summer, the independent WHO really stood out, had a 7-day-a-week vigil outside of, I think it was the UN Charter in Europe, asking for a new contract. And they were doctors who really wanted a new contract between the UN, the IAEA, and the World Health Organization, because many of their documents that they produce get suppressed and thwarted and minimized, and they're like, I have this. I mean, this is just my intuitive guess. That whole Zika scare in South America, and this is why. The Zika scare, I think, was really prompted by the World Health Organization to cover for the IAEA. I think they were told to go down there, but you could not talk about uranium mining because that Zika scare started in 2014, right? Well, in 2012, the uranium mining organizations broke into the market in South America, and every one of those little towns were downwind, were downstream of brand new uranium mines that had just been opened up within the last few years. And that's what causes the microencephaly. It's not the Zika virus causing it. We had here in Hanford 32 cases of microencephaly babies. And within 3 months, our government, the CDC, said, no, it couldn't possibly be caused by Hanford. So
this is all totally new to me. I'm pretty amazed to hear this.
It is a real shock, to be honest. But then again, our CDC. Have you seen the movie Vaxxed?
Oh, no, I haven't seen it.
You must see it because Vaxxed outlines how our CDC, the government, our agency that manages disease control, basically, they suppressed known information, known scientific information, and manipulated the numbers to promote Merck's brand new vaccine that puts the 3 measles, rubella, and mumps in one vaccine. And kids, it was skyrocketed. I gave my kids vaccines when they were babies, but they were done differently on a different schedule. They only got 3 vaccines. Right now we give our children 13 vaccines at one time. So that in the United States, a little boy has a chance. If you get a vaccine before the age of 3, a boy's chance of becoming autistic is something over 50%, slightly over 50%.
Well, this is all, really news to me, and I have to say that I'm very skeptical of the anti-vaccination movement, very much so.
I wouldn't say that it's an anti-vaccine movement. I would say that the movie Vaxxed is about the regulation of the vaccines because there was a dramatic change. So my children were vaccinated and never really got sick, right? The change came when Merck in 2000 or the mid-90s decided that they were going to put these vaccines together to save themselves money. And now in the United States, once they isolated the problem in the United States, that it wasn't specifically the individual vaccines, it was the vaccines being given all at one time. So the response with the United States government did was they do not allow you to make a decision. You have to vaccinate your children with this one type of vaccine. You can't break them up anymore. So they sided with Merck because of money. But it's a really, you must watch this show, because I would say that the movie Vaxxed, I didn't watch it for a long time myself. I only recently saw it. I've been having people telling me you have to watch, because I'm much like you. I don't think vaccines are the worst thing in the world. However, it's sort of the next step that they took it to maximize their profits.
I guess I have to take a lot of convincing about this, because I just think of funny things like walking around cemeteries in country Australia. You will see hundreds and hundreds of little tombs of little babies that died at 1, 2, 3 years old, and that will go right back to like the 1930s, before the vaccination for whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria. There's just so many lives have been saved through vaccination that it would be a hard job for me to start opposing vaccination now, even though I will grant that it can be being overdone.
Well, it's not it's kind of like, this is the interesting thing. So for me, I find it really fascinating that there was a whole group of things that were introduced into our civilization all around the 40s, like the, what's it called? or DXR, I think is called that. It was more toxic than TNT. It was the biggest thing, one of the most toxic agents that they built bombs out of in World War II, and that they are finding that it's all over the United States and poisoning all kinds of drinking water. We have high levels of nitrates all over. We have chemicals everywhere. We have nuclear waste everywhere. The vaccines that were introduced, and really, this is the point here, is I think what they're doing is playing ping pong, like whack-a-mole. So you can't really blame one thing or another, like the people in St. Louis, where they're being told you have to identify what type of radioactive element caused it before you can get remediation, right?
That's just nonsense. That's just delaying people. It's a great tactic. This is a marvelous tactic that's been used always by, I hate to use the word conservatives because there's nothing wrong with them really being conservative, but anti-progressive people, perhaps I'll put it this way, people that just want to regress. They use delaying tactics. Just going back to the nuclear thing, in this country, I think one of their biggest delaying tactics is waiting for all the Aborigines to die here, the ones who were around when they tested the bomb. The British tested a huge number of atomic bombs in an area in South Australia, and many Aborigines probably died. Aborigines were told to get out, so they got out, but they were still afflicted with the radiation. And there's not many left now because they're all in the ages of, say, 70 or older. And they are the people that are opposing the nuclear industry and doing it so bravely and strongly. And I really believe our government is just waiting for them all to die out.
What about their children? Are any of their children affected?
Possibly some of the children, but nobody's done any real work on this. But the point is the children are doing the fighting too, so they might find, the government might find to their shock that once the parents have died out, the children are still fighting them. But I think this is a great tactic. You just wait till they die out, and then it's a bit like the nuclear workers in America. I know some of them are getting compensation now, but I think they fought for an awfully long time to get it, and a lot of people died along the way.
Like over 30 years. Like this gentleman I interviewed, Larry Bergen, he was from, I think it's called Venice, Illinois, and he was working in a plant that was part of the Manhattan Project, and he was just a worker in the 80s, and all day long it was the uranium dust got on him, and one day he started getting these weird rashes and then started getting sick, and then the government came in when he realized something was wrong. The government came in with their white suits and the masks and everything, and they're sitting in there in their T-shirts in the summer. They're like, say what, And that's when they realized that they were getting sick, and he organized, and he's actually won his case to get compensation for unemployment. That's all he wanted was unemployment. He didn't sue them or anything. He's had to fight this for 26 years. He still has not gotten his money. The money still has not come in.
There's a newspaper organization or news organization in America, and I'm trying to think of the name. It is McClatchy, that had produced a wonderful, last year I think it was, not 2016, not 2017, wonderful investigation of the health of nuclear workers in America, and really superb bit of investigative journalism. I think it's McClatchy. And I think that led to and helped that many of these workers are finally getting some compensation.
Yeah, they are finally. And I think that that's because the mood of the country is that people expect them to get something. But part of what it is they just have to keep asserting their rights. I mean, they want, part of what they're trying to do is say, see, the nuclear industry is fair with our people. I mean, I just am so dumbfounded that we hear that nuclear is safe, when from cradle to grave it uses more fossil fuel. It's the most toxic thing. They still haven't got a solution for any of it. To bury it in the ground is not a solution. I mean,
well, I think buried in the ground is what you might call the least worst solution. If you could just stop producing it,
right,
and do the least worst solution, maybe think of something better along the way. But to keep on, this is the thing that gets me. Nobody, when they're talking about where are we going to put the waste, where are we going to dump it, no one says, let's stop making it.
Right.
It seems such a simple conclusion to me.
Stop. Right. Well, in New York City, that New York power plant is leaking tritium into the Hudson Bay. Their argument is that tritium doesn't last for very long, so by the time it gets into the water, it's not very harmful. Well, it does turn into harmful elements after the daughters of it go on forever. But, they're able to, because you can't, if it was orange, people wouldn't drink it. But it's not orange. You know what I mean?
That's
you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it. So all of a sudden you get cancer, or you have autoimmune disease, or you get diabetes, or your kids are all schizophrenic. My sister lives near 3 nuclear power facilities in Pennsylvania. She had 8 children. 3 of her grandchildren are autistic.
Yeah, but it's very hard to make these connections.
Exactly.
I like to try to stay with where the connections are definite, because the nuclear lobby, they lie their heads off the whole time. I mean, the fact that ionizing radiation has been definitely shown to cause cancer, they will just lie and say that's not so. Or they'll say low doses don't matter. Low doses are beneficial. This is rubbish. So they just lie the whole time. But I think they have to be fought with the facts.
Well, the thing is, and this is why I really love Dr. Busby's work, he is really pushing forward and saying he believes that low dose is actually much more harmful than big doses, because big doses, boom, you die right away, right? And we know that those are harmful. But the low dose actually really creates much more grave long-term problems, especially for children.
Absolutely, I agree. One of the arguments that are used all the time in Australia, and this annoys me a lot, we only have a research reactor, and it was set up in the 1950s with the plan to get us nuclear weapons for Australia. Now, that plan never worked out for all sorts of reasons, but they've still got the reactor. And so, as a side issue, it makes a few medical isotopes. And we are always being told that we really need these medical isotopes for nuclear medicine. Well, yes, they're useful in nuclear medicine, but they can be made differently by cyclotrons. They do not need a nuclear reactor to make them. And so they sort of use, in Australia, the story is, nuclear power's good because it helps medicine. And that's really a lie.
Yeah, that's what they say here. Of course, you can't give up the nuclear medicine. Well, frankly, nuclear medicine kills every one of its patients. It's not such a good thing,
It's got a role, but now that the cyclotrons can produce the isotopes, we don't need a nuclear reactor. And probably, I would think in the USA it would be true that nuclear medicine is overused, because it's about over 90% used for diagnosis. That is, it's not treatment. So it helps to tell you maybe that you've got this terrible condition, but it doesn't actually do anything to fix it. Right. So you might be able to get diagnosed by some safer means.
Yeah, well, they put you through like a tube. They, radiate you, and they want to give you these big X-rays, and they radiate you. And I mean, to be honest, the disregard, I have no regard. I mean, my listeners know this. I have no regard for the AMA in this country. There's a great book I recommend everybody read called Death by Medicine. And it outlines how 1 million people in the United States are killed every year at the hands of physicians and nurses, just from gross negligence.
They call it iatrogenic diseases caused by the doctor.
Is that what that's called? Iatrogenic?
Yeah, iatrogenic illnesses are caused by doctors. Well, I've got faith in the general run of the medical profession, but they're not perfect.
I would say that I don't, because when I was younger, they wanted to put me on Prozac, and I found a kinesiologist who did what I thought was the weirdest kind of stuff to me. Like, I stopped telling people about it. He's tapping on my head, and he'd given me enzymes, and I'm like, all this stuff. But you know what? Within 2 years, my arthritis was 100% reversed, and I've never had it again. I had very severe female problems. I went through menopause without any negative effects whatsoever. I mean, so I don't consider I consider them minimally, at least the American Medical Association, minimally medically educated. I don't know what doctors are like in other countries. In this country, they're very, very limited. Even the slice and dice doctors, they have no concept of how to genuinely, I just feel sorry for them. Well, look, let me get back to this topic here, because on your website, you wrote a really good article that I thought was totally awesome that I did want to ask you about. Was about the new nuclear power essentially connected to nuclear weapons, the theme for December 7, 2017, which I thought was totally awesome. And then you talked about the SMRs. Can you speak to this article a little bit?
Well, the SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors, I like the way they leave out the word nuclear. I think that's very telling.
Yes.
So the SMRs pretend to have nothing to do with nuclear. Well, the reality of small modular reactors is some of them are thorium ones. The thorium ones require plutonium or enriched uranium to start them. So you can imagine that means, for Australia, for example, that would mean importing nuclear wastes in order to get the new reactors started.
Wow.
So there's quite a whole chain of connection to the old nuclear reactors. The other thing that cracks me up about them is that they will say, well, our reactors, eat plutonium. We don't leave wastes that last for 24,000 years. Ours only last for 300 years. And you think to yourself, well, these wastes have got to be buried or guarded by security for 300 years. Is that a good idea? I mean, you could have wind turbines and solar panels, and nobody would have to guard them at all.
Right.
And but there's a lot of the other thing about them is they promote them as a help. They promote them as a help to the conventional nuclear industry because they will say that they will eat the wastes of the conventional nuclear industry.
I've heard that.
This is absolute nonsense. You can imagine what it would be like transporting all the wastes all over the world over to all these silly little reactors, which are small. If you think about the economics of that, the only way they could be economic is if a country, say for example Australia, were to order a whole lot of them, like thousands, a mass order. That would possibly be economic. But nobody's going to actually do that because who's going to order a whole heap of little reactors that mightn't work very well anyway? You won't know till you get them. It's too late, and you've ordered them and paid for them. So they're not an economic proposition. To my mind, they're just another way of keeping the nuclear industry alive.
Yeah.
With the promise.
They wanted to start them here in Oregon, and they tried to get it through these hearings at the very last minute, and people got wind of it, and the room was packed. The people in the state showed up at the state house, myself included, and said absolutely not to nuclear. And the designer, Mr. Ruiz, Jose Ruiz, he's the one. He got a $12 million check the year he left OSU, Oregon State University, from President Obama to start this program, these small nuclear reactors. And they have every intention of moving forward. But my contention is, of all the nuclear reactors, we do not have two that are exactly alike anywhere on the planet. They don't know the technology enough to replicate it. There's no cookie cutter.
Well, that's a point too.
They modify and so if you have a facility, the idea with the small nuclear reactors is it's the footprint of a gigantic nuclear reactor, but they're going to build 4 rows of 3 smaller nuclear reactors, and they're going to dig into the ground and put the waste under the nuclear reactor so that there's no transporting it. That's one of their big benefits. This is what they were saying in the hearing. Except that they really have never really run any nuclear facility successfully ever. There has never been one that has run successfully without leaking and causing massive problems.
Well, Transatomic's a company that was going to, and still are, sell small nuclear reactors, and they like many of these companies, they put a very young, attractive woman at the head. I think this is one of their new tactics, you see, to show how cool and modern they are. So they put this young woman, Leslie Dewan, as the chief executive officer, and she unfortunately came out with statements saying that there wouldn't be any waste or wouldn't be significant waste, which turned out to be not true. So that was a big embarrassment for Transatomic. So it's all very tenuous, their claims of safety. And the other thing is, they are, like all nuclear reactors, targets for terrorists.
Yeah.
And they would need a sort of containment structure that would have to be thick, concrete or something. They would need guarding. You start thinking of the costs of this, and you realise that to make it economic, it might be good if they just skimped on the thickness of the cover and skimped on the guarding and various safety measures. And one suggestion is to put them underground, but this has got all sorts of safety problems too. For example, possibility of flooding. So all the measures that they might take to make them safe from terrorism make them more expensive and less likely than ever to be an economic proposition. And then they're supposed to solve climate change for goodness sake. And even the nuclear industry, conventional nuclear industry, claims that they can solve climate change, and you think how many thousands of reactors would have to go across the world to do this. And then you think of the small reactors, how many millions would be needed. And even if they worked against climate change, which I don't think they would, but even if they did, I think they'd be a bit too late.
Mm. Well, even besides that, from cradle to grave, they use more fossil fuel because once we only can design them to work really for 20 years. Now we're extending them to 40. But once they close down, they take up lots of fossil fuel, maintaining the trucks, going back and forth, dealing with the waste and managing it. It takes up a lot of fossil fuel. And I said this to Dr. Busby when I interviewed him last year. I contend that the levels of contamination going into the Pacific Ocean and that the nuclear waste is actually contributing to the climate atmospheric problems because it's killing all the microscopic life in the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, that's right.
You cannot kill microscopic life at such a base level and ruin the biology of the Pacific Ocean. It is actually contributing, I believe, to the warming of the Pacific in a way that they're not even considering. And he was like, wow, that's an interesting idea. I'm surprised scientists aren't actually talking about this, but they aren't because they are pressured not to. Right.
Well, I don't think I think that's not the only reason, and people like Busby are trying very hard to find out everything they can, and I think that they do what they can actually prove scientifically, and it gets difficult sometimes. Some avenues take an awful lot more following up. I think we already know how bad it all is anyway. I'm not saying they shouldn't follow it up. I'm just saying I like to stick to the things they've definitely proved.
Well, this is the thing. If you look at Dr. Goffman's work,
Yes.
I mean, I have a big fat book of low-level radioactivity. I mean, he did definitive work.
Yes.
Dr. Pauling and Dr. Tamplin did definitive work that has been ignored. And so when they say we need more studies, I contend we don't actually need more studies. We need to pay attention to the science that we already know.
And we ignore anything that's done by the Russians.
Completely. Yeah.
I think the name of the man who only died last year was Yablokov.
Yeah,
I think
yes.
And
yes.
he did extensive study of the Chernobyl survivors and the rates of cancer and birth defects and so forth. And his work has been completely ignored by the West
Right.
because he's Russian, so he must be wrong. And there's another person in Dr. Vladimir. I can't think of his surname at the moment. It'll come back to me. He worked in Ukraine and very carefully worked with the authorities in Ukraine to show a certain area where the people had remained living there and who were living on the local diet, which included a lot of mushrooms, which is important, and they had very, very high rates of birth deformities. And he was able to show that this is very likely linked to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
Levenchko, right?
No, not Vladimir. Oh, it just escapes me. It began with a W anyway.
Okay,
I'll have to send it to you on email. But
yeah.
This is ignored because, of course, he did this in Ukraine, and we can't really trust those Eastern European people, can we?
Well, the thing is, they don't want to talk about it because it ends up, then they're going to have to admit that Chernobyl was much bigger than what. I mean, frankly, Chernobyl's not resolved either. Hanford's not resolved. WIP is not resolved. I mean, every single nuclear collapse, every single nuclear facility that has gone into crisis is still in crisis.
Well, you do see little bits about, for instance, the wild boars and the wild deer in Europe that are still radioactive,
right,
that have come from that area,
right,
that show that the problem's still there.
It is a long-term, massive, and I think maybe, Noel, the issue is when you've been lying for so long, how do you stop? I think that's, like I was reading this article on DTR, I think it's called, that poison that I mentioned earlier. The government's lied about it for as long as we can remember. It's since the 40s. So at what point do you begin to start telling the truth? How do you back down from lying after decades and decades?
Well, some people do. One of our scientists, Sir Marcus Oliphant, who was a fan of nuclear power, and he was even one of the ones who did research leading to the atomic bomb, he changed his mind later and said it's too dangerous, it's a bad idea. So he stepped back. But it sort of takes someone with a bit of guts to do that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's the thing, because you get ridiculed. I mean, and then people get angry. I mean, I know that myself, I spent some time being angry even at Arnie Gunderson, because when the Fukushima first happened, when I first found out about it, he was like, yeah, well, it's not so bad. Then the more I got into it, and frankly, the more he got into it, the more he realized it was really horrible, and he really started taking a more hard line, right? But
yes.
So what happens is people that are paying attention, who don't have the education of somebody like Mr. Gunderson. First, I was like super mad at him. Like, how could he not see this? Like, I was just like furious with him. And then over time, I've come to understand that even it's almost harder for the scientists who have been working in this to, like, because it breaks all of their previous norms, breaks everything, they lose their careers, they lose their friends, they lose their family. If, in many instances they lose their family, everything falls apart for them, and they lose their credibility, everything they've worked for. So it's much harder for a nuclear scientist to step back and say, you know what, we've been wrong for the last 40 years.
Absolutely. Of course it is. I think it's a bit like the Catholic Church, the Pope and the Cardinals. If he sat down and thought about it and thought, maybe there really isn't any God. Oh, I can't think that. It'd sort of ruin the whole thing, wouldn't
it? Yeah, for real. Well, you know what? We're coming up into our last minute. I really want to thank you for joining us. My goodness, this has gone so fast.
Yes, it's been really good, and I admire the work that you're doing there, Lonnie.
Well, I admire your work. You can catch her work. And Noelle goes by the. Do you mind if I tell them your name on the website so they'll see your work?
No, that would be fine. I'd like that. That'd be good.
She goes by the name of Christina MacPherson, and she is really a rock and a solid rock of foundation on that website. And I genuinely appreciate all of your work. I can't tell you how much it means to me. It's kind of like the one place we know we can go to get good, verifiable information that brings it all together and summarizes it so well. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lonnie. So much. Very encouraging.
Well, bye-bye. You guys, put your courage feet on, and like I say, take action. It does matter what you do. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Noelle, for joining us.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.